domain area against the backdrop of the new normal. Over to you, Dr. Felix.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I'll try to be brief. So greetings to all that are here, all due protocols observed. So I hope you're able to see my slides, and I'll attempt to go through this as quickly as I can. So, my presentation today is really about human capital and how we think about human capital. And it's part of a broader argument that I would like to advance as it relates to many of the practical problems that exist in the world, as it relates to business and other areas of the social sciences and so on. I believe that part of the issue is conceptual. The way that we begin thinking about things or defining things has an impact in terms of how it is that we understand problems and as a result, solutions. So my presentation today is really a very brief case study on migrant workers in Vietnam during the fourth wave of the pandemic that occurred in Ho Chí Minh City, which is a city that is in the south. It's the city which I'm situated in. And what is very interesting here is that the actions of the migrant workers, it subverts common conceptions of human capital, both as a concept and as a theory. And I thought that in, given that the conference is really about examining trends, I would say that it is important for us when we look at trends for us to be very careful about generalizations and not to generalize generalizations. And I believe that when we find outlier cases or things that may resist generalization, they are worth paying attention to rather than overlooking. So anomalies are very important. So just to go through some very quick figures here and to build some context to what I'm going to discuss. The first wave of COVID-19 occurred January 1st in 2020, followed by the second wave in March. In July, there was the third wave, and then it is that there was a big space, there was a lull. And then earlier this year, in late April, Vietnam experienced the fourth wave of COVID-19. Now, globally, Vietnam has been recognized as one of the countries that was able to some extent, weather the storm, given the resources that are available, among other factors. But the pandemic COVID-19, it has been so. I don't think it is that anyone is not affected. No country, no group is essentially untouched by the pandemic. So it is that with this fourth wave, based on the publicly available data that was published in the press, Ho Chí Minh City, received a substantial blow, so to speak, in terms of its GDP. There were certain sectors that were more adversely affected than others. And this, is nothing that is particularly unique to Vietnam, but this occurred all over the world. Now, focusing our attention here on the Vietnamese context, I want to point out here that the migrant worker community, and I'm talking about internal migrants, that is, they really have been at the center of popular discourse as seen in the media, right? They have been highlighted as a very, very important demographic. So to give some more information in terms of why these internal migrants are important, well, there are 5 basic reasons. There are more, but we'll just work with these 5 reasons here. Now, these internal migrants are really the backbone of the urban manufacturing hubs. Secondly, their productivity is very much so needed in expanding and sustaining the national economy, especially given the trade war with the US and China and with other geopolitical issues, which has caused investors and different interest groups to shift attention to Vietnam for trade, manufacturing, different types of business and otherwise. Now, human capital has been raised by a number of global experts and local experts here in Vietnam regarding social and economic recovery post-pandemic. And when I use the term post-pandemic, I'm talking about after the pandemic. I think it's one way that we can talk about a post-pandemic world life as it occurs after the pandemic, not necessarily when the pandemic is over, because we have no clue when that would be. The fourth point here relates to businesses in Ho Chi Minh City, right? As you know, this southern metropolis is a hub for many different types of businesses, and there's a great need for employable persons. And of course, just as in other parts of the world, labor shortages remain a critical issue. So again, these migrants are a very, very important demographic. So Vietnamese experts estimate that about 12% of the population at a minimum is considered to be, not highly skilled or not trained, right? Now, this is a very, very, or I should say they can be, let me rephrase that, about 12% are actually highly skilled or trained. So that means it is that you have a large cross-section of people who do not fall into that category. Now, if it is that we look at the global data, Vietnam ranks very low on the Global Talent Competitiveness Index, right? While at the same time, interestingly, scoring very high on the Global Innovation Index, right? Now, again, this is very telling because with the Global Talent Index, this again has to do with measuring human capital and the implications of this low score. Now, a little bit about rural-urban migration in Vietnam. Firstly, it is quite a common occurrence, and there are several reasons for this, but some of the top reasons include the limited infrastructure that exists in rural areas, of course, the limited employment opportunities as a result, and also the need for greater social mobility among specific groups. So in terms of the data on internal migration, according to UNESCO, upwards of 13.6% of a population of over 96 million. In some estimates, you may find that Vietnam ranks the total number of the population as upwards of 98. So it really depends on the nature of the report that you look at. It would be anywhere between 96 to 98 million. Now, over 85% of migrants are between the ages of 15 to about 39 years old. It's a fairly young demographic. Females represent more than half of this number. And education, employment, and family-related concerns are some of the main reasons for this type of mobility. Now, going into the specifics regarding the case study here. Now, given that Vietnam experienced the fourth wave of COVID-19 in late April 2021, it caused really a mass migration, reverse migration that is to occur. Now, Ho Chi Minh City in the south, the southern metropolis here, which is home to many large-scale manufacturing and industrial hubs, right? This was quite a cause for concern. So a lot of people went back to wherever they came from, and many of them from other southern localities. And of course, this created issues in terms of labor shortages, and it compounded issues with the supply chain. Again, and the issues with the supply chain, pre-COVID-19, there were issues that existed before, but again, with the pandemic, it just compounded a lot of the existing issues that were there. Now, of course, small businesses were definitely impacted by this mass migration of workers. So it is that the workers, yes, a significant portion of them worked in the manufacturing hubs, but some of them also worked in smaller businesses and medium-sized businesses as well. In 2020, the government started offering state-funded support for upskilling, persons who were affected by COVID-19. Of course, this demographic, these internal migrant workers were definitely impacted, and they were, eligible. And a few months later, in 2021, the Australian government and New Zealand as well, they decided to collaborate with Vietnam in hopes of improving the skills of local workers to prepare them for the post-pandemic world, taking into account the fourth industrial revolution, automation, AI, machine learning, and that sort of thing. Now, what was very interesting is that with all of these offers for upskilling and reskilling and vocational training and so on and so forth, is that there was a continual rejection of these educational opportunities. It was very, very common for people to reject these offers to, better themselves in one way or the other. So it is that they can have an income, they can have stable employment, they can be prepared for the future, be much more future oriented in their decisions and whatnot. Now, this is very, very telling here because this ongoing rejection was something that was thoroughly documented in the news. And there were several reasons for the rejection, of course. But I want to turn our attention very quickly to some of the implications for policy and practice as it relates to this rejection of the offer that was made. It was totally free, totally voluntary, and yet it was by and large rejected. So this effort was, in one sense, it was a failure. So the actions here of the migrant workers are particularly interesting because it really runs counter to traditional human capital logic, right? In that people's social participation in educational attainment is something that is desirable, something that they want, and that the effects are uniform. So if it is that there's education that's available, it's a desirable stuff, it's something that's desirable or rational, and people will go partake in it, and then they will be able to see the effects in both the short and long term. And that is not necessarily the case. And with this case study here, with this very sizable demographic, this is something to take note. For many of the migrant workers, they switched industries. Some of them got back into agriculture, or it is that there were other types of businesses that they got into when it is that they left the city, if they were able to. And what I think really stands out here is to consider people's engagement and their disengagement in the workforce and in educational attainment. Now, I'm talking about all of this from a post-structuralist standpoint. And when I say that I'm talking about this from a post-structuralist standpoint, I'm really referring to the fact that it's helpful for us to really question the nature of the categories that we use to define and classify people. And to understand that much of our understanding of the world is shaped by different discourses that emerge both historically and socially. So given that the whole concept, the notion of human capital, it's a very young concept, and as problematic as it is, as many other scholars have pointed out, it's not an entirely useless concept, because to date there really hasn't been a replacement for such a concept. And I want to talk about some of the problems with this common line of assumption that goes with not just using human capital as a concept, but the way in which it is that we think about people, because ultimately we do what we do and we think about people's engagement with technology in business and whatnot, because it's really about people at the end of the day. And I think it is that there's a particular problem we need to try to be aware of and resist. And as it relates to the whole notion of human capital development, the disembodiment of productivity, I believe, is very counterproductive. So if it is that policymakers and businesses are really concerned about advancing economic interests, we cannot just think about people as a collection of skills. As some of the other presenters mentioned before, that people are more than just the skills that they have. And there was talk about people's mental and emotional well-being and so on and so forth. And there are several reasons why it is that the migrant workers in this particular instance rejected the offers for education. Some had concerns about its relevance, and there were lots of other concerns that they have that did not necessarily have to do with their health, right? So yes, people not wanting to suffer from COVID-19 and perhaps die was one consideration, but there were many other reasons that people rejected the offer as well, where it is that they were operating with a very different value system. So what was offered to them was not necessarily something that they deemed in high esteem. Now, before it is that I end my presentation here, I want to quote something from the economist Thomas Sowell and leave us with a question, right? Because the way in which it is that we conceptualize people and the way in which it is that we think about systems that people have to fit into, I believe it is worth considering if it is that we are being dehumanizing in that way. If it leads to much more practical problems, because this that we need to be much more expansive in the way in which we conceptualize people and the worlds in which they live. So Thomas Sowell says that abstract people are very convenient, right? They can be aggregated into statistical categories such as households, families, and income brackets without the slightest concern for whether those statistical categories contain similar people, or even the same numbers of people, or people who differ substantially, much less in finer distinctions. Now, this is worth paying attention to here, because statistical categories are not necessarily a bad thing. They're not inherently a bad thing. But again, this is just one frame of reference, and it's important for us to be aware of the limits of the different frames of reference that we use to think about business-related matters and ultimately matters that involve people. So the question that I would like to leave everyone with today is, when we talk about human capital, who are the humans that we are referring to, right? I think this is important for us to try to avoid a massive problem in social science research in the early 20th century, especially when it relates to media studies and people were studying the impacts of the mass media. There was this tendency to think of audiences and to think of people in the abstract. And this was, again, a massive problem that led to the whole-scale rejection of this sort of thinking. But again, even though it was quote-unquote formally rejected by scholars and in the literature, it's a very common line of reasoning, right? So my question is, who are the humans of human capital? Exactly, who are we really referring to? And if it is that you scan the QR code, it will take you to a short documentary that I produced earlier this year for another event that elaborates on some of these concepts in much more detail, however, with a greater focus on higher education. So with that said, I will end my presentation here and invite any questions or comments that any of the participants or panel members might have at this point. Thank you.